Night hangs over the Bosque Redondo like a held breath. The adobe walls breathe heat into the dark, the Pecos whispering somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. A barefoot figure pads across the hard-packed earth toward a doorway he knows almost by feel, a hand resting on the curve of a revolver tucked in the waistband. Inside, a taller man waits, motionless, a shadow inside shadows. The barefoot man lifts his chin, sensing someone in the room. Quién es? The reply is not a name. It is the sudden bloom of light and sound, the crack that starts 100 years of argument. But that end begins somewhere else entirely, in a county where money made law, and the law sometimes answered to money. We step back, years, miles, grudges, and watch the fire catch. Lincoln County in the late 1870s sprawled like a country unto itself. Vast ranches, thin lines of river, and a single main street where every handshake was insured by a six-gun. Two rival houses, Murphy and Dolan on one side, and the upstart partnership of John Tunstall and Alexander McSween on the other, fought for the right to sell goods, control cattle, and command credit. When Tunstall was gunned down on February 18, 1878, out on his land, the prairie caught fire. The men who rode to avenge him called themselves Regulators, and among them, neither the most seasoned nor the oldest, was a wiry youth with unsettling calm in his eyes. Henry McCarty, alias William H. Bonney, alias Billy the Kid. The fighting that followed was not one clean story, but a swarm of them. Warrants served by enemies, witnesses who crossed the street when trouble came, and courthouse business that moved with the speed of cattle at a water gap. The Battle of Lincoln, a 5-day shootout in July 1878, turned houses into fortresses and windows into rifle ports. Smoke drifted in the summer heat. Men counted bullets by the handful and promises by the dozen. When the U.S. cavalry finally enforced a halt, the war's embers kept glowing, each debt remembered, each insult salted away. Out of that long simmer, the county's future took shape, and so did its most enduring myth. Billy the Kid, whose face looks almost boyish in the one famous tintype, had a gift for slipping bonds, literal and otherwise. Newspapers took to him early. Even far-off editors learned to like the sound of his name. He wrote to Governor Lew Wallace, the former Union general sent to cool New Mexico's fever, and pledged to trade testimony for amnesty. Whether the promise was made and broken or merely misunderstood depends on the witness you believe. The letters remain, artifacts of a strange courtship between law and outlaw, each sounding reasonable on paper and impossible on the ground. Now turn the coin and meet the man who would chase him. Patrick Floyd Garrett was long-limbed and spare, the kind of Westerner who carried more reach than weight. He had hunted buffalo, tended bar, and learned the faces of men who smiled while measuring what you kept under your coat. He was not born to a star, he took it on. In November 1880, the voters of Lincoln County decided they'd had enough of cattle lifted by moonlight and ledgers that balanced in gun smoke. They chose Garrett sheriff, and with the tin pinned to his vest, he set his sights squarely on the most famous rustler alive. That moment was the wager, that one man with authority and a steady hand could force order upon a county that resented any reign but its own. A sheriff in Lincoln did not simply execute warrants. He spoke 2 languages, 3 if you count the unprinted one that men speak with chin tilts and hand rests on belt buckles. He needed friends where friendship was expensive, informants where silence was cheaper, and the patience to drink coffee he didn't want in kitchens where he wasn't welcome. Garrett began by reading the ground. Trails worn into the mesquite told him where horses had been. Stray talk at a dance told him where men would go. The kid had a gift for turning hospitality into cover. He moved through the Hispano communities of the Pecos with ease, playing cards, dancing, leaning against a doorway to trade jokes as if the world wasn't hunting him. Garrett's answer was a colder sort of charm. He listened. Pride made men brag. Bragging left tracks. He followed. This portrait draws on documented movements and social patterns. Specifics of language and kitchen tables are the texture of the time. December drew down like a Titan loop. In Fort Sumner, a winter sting went bad for the outlaws. Garrett's posse, waiting in the dark, mistook Tom O'Folliard for the kid and dropped him in the street. The survivors fled into the cold, And 3 nights later, Garrett cornered them at a stone jacal near a rancid spring the herders called Stinking Springs. Inside were Billy, Charlie Boder, Dave Rudabaugh, Tom Pickett, and Billy Wilson. Hunger and the wind did as much work as the rifles. By morning, Boder lay dead, and the rest, Billy among them, walked out with their hands high. The young outlaw's smile, the one that later artists would sketch onto every poster and pulp, was gone. He was the bigger prize alive. Somewhere between capture and courthouse, the kid recovered his grin. He played to crowds in Las Vegas, New Mexico, answered questions, and kept the press halfway charmed. That was part of the trouble. Billy understood that a man could be tried in columns before he ever faced a jury. Garrett, less easy with show, kept his counsel and led his prisoner south to Mesilla, where the court would be sterner and the verdict, so folks said, more certain. In April 1881, a territorial judge named Warren Bristol heard the state's case connected to Sheriff William Brady's killing. When the jurors filed back and spoke the word that meant a short rope and a short fall, Billy stood as if he were the bystander, the whole spectacle a show put on for somebody else. The date was set for May 13th. If the kid felt fear, he wore it under his skin. Yet the story of the West is cunning, not just courage. The sheriff rode back to Lincoln, believing his job, if not done, then fenced in. Men build gallows with lumber. The condemned build their chances with eyes in waiting. In the courthouse that doubled as a jail, the prisoner noted which deputies trusted routine, which doors stuck, which keys rattled free on a careless loop. He asked for small favors, a trip to the privy, a step ahead on the stairs. It is one thing to command a firing line in a desert wind. It is another to read the moment when a man's attention flinches and slip the cuff like a snake sheds skin. That read would change everything. The specific staging of these observations is reconstructed from testimony and later accounts. Historians agree on the jailbreak's result and casualties, not every second by second. Before the crack in the stairwell, before the shotgun boomed from an upstairs window, before the gallows date turned to prairie dust, there was simply a sheriff who had made a bet and an outlaw who refused to play his assigned part. One believed in the rulebook, the other believed in luck and nerve. As winter eased into a dry New Mexico spring, the people of Lincoln watched a contest as old as the frontier. Not good versus evil, no story here yields that cleanly, but resolve versus audacity, order versus the brilliant, infuriating talent of a young man for slipping any tie that bound him. The prairie waits, indifferent as always. But the iron is heating. The stairwell is ahead in the window. The county has rolled its dice, so has the sheriff. The kid, shackled but smiling, is still finding the edges of his cage with a palm. In a few days, men will swear they heard shots and footsteps and cries, each telling it a little differently, each sure the story belongs to him. For now, there is only that feeling the old cowhands know, a storm building over the range, too far to smell the rain, close enough to taste the change in the air. The winter came in with a blade between its teeth. North wind knifed off the plains, rimming stock tanks and glass, turning the Pecos into a slow black mirror. Garrett's riders pulled their hats low, bandanas up, and hunched into that hard season the way men do who expect no comfort from the world. The line between patience and predation is thin. Garrett lived on it now, eating when the horses ate, sleeping when rumor went quiet, moving when a fresh print or a careless word showed him the way. He didn't need to be faster than the kid. He only needed to be harder to shake. In Fort Sumner, someone laughed at the wrong hour and the hunt snapped shut. Tom O'Folliard, Billy's big-footed, big-hearted running mate, rode into the dark and met a rifle's whisper. The shot hit him in the chest. He fell wrong and breathed hard for 3/4 of an hour, long enough for the cold to claim the steam of him. He was 22, maybe younger, and he died under a New Mexico sky, while his friends could only watch his breath thin and leave. Years later, the cemetery at Old Fort Sumner would hold him in the same ground as the boy he'd followed. But on that December 19th, 1880, his passing was a warning. The hunter was close, and winter favored the man who could wait longer. From that moment, the kid's world tightened. He drifted with 3, sometimes 4 companions, Charlie Boder, Dave Rudabaugh, Billy Wilson, Tom Pickett, seeking warmth where he could and cover where he must. The outlaw's gift is movement. The lawman's gift is listening. Garrett listened to a vaquero who mentioned fresh sign near a seep fouled by livestock, to a woman who said a tall one had asked for coffee at dawn, to a boy who traced hoof cuts in the frozen mud with a stick. The country itself spoke a rough language, wind-scoured sand that kept no tracks, drifts that preserved a story all night long. Garrett read that script the way a parson reads a psalm. Two storms buried Fort Sumner. His posse layered wool over denim and pressed on, wanting the fire at a jacal called Stinking Springs. They found it at daybreak on December 23rd, a low stone pen shouldering into the land, smoke leaking like a secret from the roofline. The men inside smelled of damp wool and cold grease. They had played cards until the lamplight wavered. When the first shape stepped into the yard, Charlie Boder, with his blanket thrown over his shoulder, a bullet met him. He folded into the dirt, and the house answered with a ragged burst that knocked chips from stone and took no man down. The wind did its old work, stealing heat, shrinking courage. Garrett's men settled behind mesquite and rock. There is a moment in any siege when one side decides it has become tomorrow already, and continuing the fight will not make it today again. Near noon, hands came out first, then gray faces, then the rattling steps of hungry men. Billy the Kid walked last, still wearing a kind of poise that looked like humor if you didn't look too close. The bigger prize alive, Garrett thought. The country is full of men who can kill. It rarely needs another corpse. They shackled the prisoners and hauled them, first to Fort Sumner, then toward Las Vegas, New Mexico, where a crowd doesn't so much gather as appear. Word flies faster than a horse. When the train coughs steam at the depot, a knot of men armed with indignation and whiskey demanded Dave Rudabaugh for an old killing. Garrett stood with his back square to the car and said no, in a voice that did not carry heat. In the recounting, the scene grows larger. The sheriff holding the line while politics and vendetta try to pry the door. However you tell it, the law kept its prisoners. The train hissed, and the wheels took up their iron hymn for Santa Fe. The kid sat for a little interview, cheeky as always, telling a reporter that the laugh was on him this time, and that with a Winchester he'd lick the whole crowd. Whatever else he was, Billy understood theater. That day he played his part to the Railtown Gallery. Santa Fe in January is a hard teacher. Thick-walled jail, iron that bites at the skin, a light that comes late and leaves early. There the kid handled his legend like a deck of cards, showing one face to the guards and another to the press. The Las Vegas Gazette sent a man to see him, a rare jailhouse interview printed January 20th, 1881, that let the territory eavesdrop on its most famous prisoner. The kid sounded merry enough on the page, insulted by cheap engravers and their dime novel fantasies, equal parts proud and wounded at the way his name printed in black. Men who had only ever seen him framed by rumor could now hear his answers, casual and cutting, stitched together with boys and fellows, and the kind of relaxed contempt that either charms you or makes you want to see the rope pulled. For 3 months he waited, writing to Governor Lew Wallace, courting clemency on paper while iron wore his ankles raw. Outside the jailhouse, editors sharpened their knives and their adjectives. Some leaned into the monster story, an outlaw as disease, a cure demanded. Others admired the audacity, calling him bold as a young cougar, too pretty by half, a devil made for headlines. The kid did not invent his own myth, but he learned to write it. Newspapers of the territory and beyond were bridles enough. That was the other war in New Mexico that year, fought not with Winchesters and buckshot, but with columns and caricatures, with the public mood as the battlefield. Garrett, who favored facts over flourish, would learn that an arrest wins you less than a front page. By spring, the talk turned south. The courtroom would be in Mesilla, Doña Ana County, where the case tied to Sheriff William Brady's death could be tried at a remove from Lincoln's old feuds. Judges do what bullets cannot. The name on the bench, Warren Bristol, belonged to a man of the time, and this time was not one for sympathetic readings of rustlers turned celebrities. Mesilla was a town of shade trees and plazas, adobe and argument. A jury could be found there that would listen first and then make up its mind. The kid rode down in chains between men who had heard enough of his jokes to stop finding them funny. The territory, bruised from the Lincoln County War, wanted something that felt like an ending. No one could miss the tension coiling in Garrett as those months wore him thin. The sheriff had placed a hard bet in November, restore order by bringing in the kid, and the ledger now showed both profit and risk. The capture at Stinking Springs had proved the first point, but winter victories decay in the spring if the state cannot complete what the badge begins. Garrett had to hold his prisoner against mobs and schemes, against the kid's sly charm and nimble mind, against newspapers that preferred calamity to closure. He carried the knowledge every peace officer on the frontier carried, that law is a kind of thread you stretch across a canyon and then walk, hoping the wind doesn't remember its old habits. When he slept, if he slept, he dreamed of doors opening, of stairs, of a sudden movement at the edge of vision. Yet there were small mercies. The watch turned regularly. The jailers learned not to give the prisoner more rope than the shackles allowed. Visitors talked too loudly in corridors, but not loudly enough to drown the sound of keys. The sheriff told himself that work well done would carry through the courtroom doors and speak for itself. Justice moves slowly. That is both its virtue and its weakness. In April, the case would finally be called, and men would raise their right hands and swear to things they had seen through smoke, to words they had heard over the racket of hoofbeats and anger. The jury would listen with patient faces, weighing not just a man's acts but the county's need for a horizon without gunfire. As the train rattled south, past cottonwoods shedding winter bark, past little stations where children stopped to count the cars, the man in irons doffed a phantom hat to a world that couldn't stop looking at him. He had said, more than once, that the laugh was on him. Even so, he seemed to hold some private punchline. Garrett in the adjacent coach sat stiff and quiet, a lawman whose victory tasted like sand. The hardest part of any hunt is not the tracking or the taking, it is the keeping. A frontier learns that lesson again and again, until it is no longer a frontier. Mesilla lay ahead, and with it, a courtroom that promised to turn the long winter's ride into a single verdict. A sheriff's gamble, tallied in ledgers of snow and blood, was about to meet the arithmetic of the law. Mesilla sat beneath a pale April sun, its plaza drowsing under cottonwoods in the slow shuffle of boots. Wagons groaned past the adobe walls. Church bells told a note that was neither mournful nor glad, just the everyday heartbeat of a territorial town that had learned to live with hard news. Into this quiet came the trial that so many had awaited, the territory of New Mexico versus William H. Bonney, tied to the killing of Sheriff William Brady back in the worst days of Lincoln's War. The courthouse smelled of dust and old paper. Men balanced chairs on two legs and pretended not to stare when the prisoner entered, small-boned in chains, the famous hat pushed back to clear a face that never seemed to hold the same age 2 days running. Judge Warren Bristol presided with the stillness of a man accustomed to noise around him. The prosecutor spoke in the flat, steady manner that can carry farther than a shout. The defense offered what it could, calling the fog of war and the confusion of testimony to the stand, as if imprecision itself might be a witness. The jury watched with the patience of farmers measuring rain in their minds. When the witnesses recounted those seconds on Lincoln's dusty street, the shapes of men blurred by gun smoke, the split despair and triumph of a firefight finished before all participants knew it had begun, the room leaned forward to see if, at last, the story would hold still. It did not. Stories from the frontier rarely do. But the pieces the court needed were there, and when the jurors returned, they brought the simple word the law depends on when certainty is impossible: guilty. The sentence followed as sentences do, a formality that feels like thunder. To be hanged by the neck until dead, with the date appointed in May. If compassion lives anywhere in such a moment, it lives, oddly, in a town's practicality, for Mesilla could pass its judgments. But Lincoln still claimed the right to set a gallows on its own ground. The prisoner would be carried back to the very town that had made his name, and now meant to take it from him. Billy listened, head tilted, mouth forming that uncatchable half-smile. And when the formal words were done, he looked as though he might laugh at the sky for being so blue on a day like this. He had performed for reporters, traded jabs with jailers, even charmed an audience that should have hated him more than it did. But there is a hinge in every legend, a point at which the bravado can no longer be spent like coin. The transfer to Lincoln would prove that hinge. The Lincoln County Courthouse had been a mercantile once, a big, thick-walled building that kept heat the way a memory keeps a grudge. It was a store turned office turned jail, a frontier kind of logic that made do with whatever stood at hand. They lodged the prisoner upstairs, leg-ironed, watched by two men who could not have been more different if the county had drawn them from opposite ends of a deck. Deputy James Bell was quiet, dutiful, the sort one might trust with a ledger or a friend's child. Deputy Bob Ollinger was another matter, a broad-shouldered braggart, fond of whiskey and reputation, proud owner of a double-barreled 10-gauge that he called chicken feed on account of the buckshot he swore could scatter sense into any fool who needed it. The kid listened when Ollinger talked. Men who plan their exits study not just walls and keys, but habits and pride. Lincoln in late April has a wind that lifts grit into the teeth. The gallows timbers had not yet been raised, but men were already speaking of the best spot for a view, as if the execution were a fair day promised by the calendar. The prisoner learned the quarry of every hour, which keys chimed loudest on which man's belt, where the stairs creaked so sharply a fox would have paused, which windows caught the afternoon glare and blinded a watcher without warning. He asked for small courtesies, water poured, a trip to the privy, the leg irons eased for a moment so he could hobble with dignity. A jail teaches two lessons at once, the law's reach and the fallibility of men. The kid absorbed them both with the same almost idle attention that made deputies underestimate him and newspapermen overpraise him. April 28, 1881 fell like a stone through clear water. Ollinger took the other prisoners across the street for their meal, the big 10-gauge slung easy in his hands, the metal gleaming as if already telling its own story. That left Bell upstairs with Billy, a quiet man and a famous one, approaching the sort of errand that turns a routine into a crucible. The kid asked to go to the outhouse. Bell obliged, guiding him down the hall. What happened next lives through the testimony of survivors and the embroidery of legend. A stumble, a twist, a pawing hand that found steel where it had no right to be. A gun rested and the sharp indoor crack of a pistol that turned the stairway into a killing place. Bell staggered, hit near the heart and fell, leaving a trail of blood along the banister. He touched the landing as though he meant to continue his duty even in dying. Then the breath left him, and with it a silence, like a church emptied between services. That single shot called Ollinger back as surely as if his name had been cried in the plaza. He came at a trot, the giant shotgun balanced in his hands, his boots hammering the hard-packed earth of the yard. Upstairs, the kid moved with that cold efficiency that frightens even men who admire such things. He found the 10-gauge where Ollinger had left it earlier, a fool's trust in habit, and stepped to a window. One barrel's charge leaped into the light. The pellets fetched Ollinger, lifting him, some said, and folding him up on himself in the yard. The second barrel, some accounts say it remained unfired, others that it boomed a breath later, was almost beside the point. The town heard only the first thunder and the sickening after silence that always follows a close-range kill. What words passed, if any, between killer and killed are now the property of dime novels and recollection. Whether the outlaw said, "Hello, Bob," or something rougher, the result was the same. A deputy lay dead in his own dust. Panic is a creature with many legs. It can run in all directions at once and get nowhere. In the courthouse, the kid moved like a man canceling appointments. He collected pistols, cut his irons, and found a horse with the assurance of someone who has rehearsed escape so often in his head that the world feels obligated to comply. Some remembered him whistling. Others swore he paused to fix a saddle strap with the care of a ranch hand not to be hurried. He rode through Lincoln at a canter that was neither hurried nor lazy, and by the time the town's courage gathered itself, by the time shouts turned into a chase, the dust of him had already joined the greater dust of the road. Word flew, by rider, by telegraph, by the quick tongue of fear, and with it came the formal price on his head. $500 is a sum with weight on the frontier, enough to refurbish a ranch or ruin a man's resolve. Reward posters do more than name a fugitive. They license every stranger's curiosity. They enlist men who have never met each other into a fraternity of pursuit. The kid slipped into the Pecos country, where faces were familiar and doors opened in the dark. He ate as a cousin, danced as a friend, and vanished as a rumor, moving from jacal to camp to adobe rooms where lamplight painted his profile on a wall, only to have the night erase it an hour later. There are places on that river where a whisper travels farther than a rider, and those were the places he chose. For Pat Garrett, the news struck like a hammer. He had won a winter's hunt, hauled a prize through the gauntlet of crowds and courtroom, and watched the law pronounce an ending. Now the ending had been torn out by the roots and flung down the road like a challenge. Fury, when it comes to a man built of restraint, arrives not as rage but as a narrowing. Garrett ate and slept less, spoke in fewer words, and began again the patient work of hearing the country as if it were a man with something to confess. He found, as he had found before, that women often knew more than men, and that boys noticed details their fathers overlooked. He doled out dollars, favors, and promises, like a man spending from a purse that must not run dry. He had, too, a different kind of pressure now, the sort that does not show on a wanted bill. Some citizens saw the escape as proof that all this badge and court talk was vanity, that Lincoln County's order remained a rumor best told in parlor rooms. Others loathed the blood on the courthouse stairs and blamed Garrett by chain of command. The sheriff understood that his gamble, restore order by putting Billy the Kid on a scaffold, could no longer pay out in the way he had planned. So he altered the wager. If the law could not finish it in daylight, he would finish it in the dark, with the same relentless patience that winter had taught him. The trail, he knew, would run through friendship and fear, through dances and kitchens, through the quiet loyalty of those who beloved the kid, and the tired resignation of those who had begun to doubt him. Some said the outlaw would vanish into Mexico. Others guessed he would circle back to the one place where memory felt like a blanket. Fort Sumner, where the ghost of hospitality still had a room for him, and the Maxwell name could turn suspicion into civility. The sheriff weighed those guesses, measured the distances, and chose to trust the oldest logic in the territory. A man runs in a circle if you give him time. Garrett saddled up with fewer men this time, men he could trust to hold their tongues and their nerve. The prairie had changed clothes, trading winter's iron for summer's heat, but the work was the same. A hunter reading the wind, an outlaw testing the darkness, a county waiting to learn whether its long fever would at last break. The stairwell in Lincoln still smelled of gunpowder and old wood. Someone had scrubbed the blood, and still the stains showed like a bad memory beneath fresh water. Men walked softer there for a time, hats in hand. Then life, which rarely pauses out here for anyone's grief, tugged them back to chores and cattle and the price of corn. But under the return to routine lay a new edge, the kind that sharpens a place the way a whetstone sharpens steel. They had seen how quickly a verdict could become a rumor. They had watched the kid step through a door that had been meant to close on him forever. And they had understood, finally, that the sheriff's gamble would be settled not by a rope in the sunshine, but by whatever waited in a dark room somewhere down the trail. By July, the Pecos ran low, a ribbon of warm, green water slipping past cottonwoods and the adobe walls that held the day's heat long after sundown. Fort Sumner drowsed in that heat, cards slapped on kitchen tables, a guitar's soft thrum, a door left open to invite the night wind. The Maxwell place was the largest shadow on the edge of town, its rooms a crossroads for stories and errands, and the small loyalties that make a frontier habitable. The name Maxwell still meant something from Cimarron to the Bosque Redondo. People came with favors to ask and news to trade. Sometimes they came because the moonlit yard felt like a little square of safety carved from a wide and hungry country. Into this thicket of kin and custom, rumor threaded like smoke. "The kid's back," someone whispered. A cousin's cousin saw him at dusk, hat slouched low, laughing with a pair of vaqueros as if he'd never heard the words rope or reward. Someone else swore he'd been at a dance 2 nights running, stepping light, trading jokes, a hand on a girl's waist the way boys hold the future when they believe it still belongs to them. He had friends in that place, or at least faces that softened when they saw him. There is a kind of shelter made not from timber but from affection, and the kid walked within it. If danger kept a calendar, Fort Sumner offered him one more page. Pat Garrett read those whispers the way a wolf reads wind. He rode in quiet with 2 men, John Poe and Kip McKinney, and no posse to advertise his intent. It is one thing to surround a stone jacal in winter. It is another to slip into a summer town where every doorway has eyes and ears. Poe had a newspaperman's memory for detail and a deputy's steadiness. McKinney had a good seat on a horse and the particular courage of men who keep their doubts to themselves until the job is done. They tied off in shadow and became shadows, moving across the yard as carefully as men crossing a frozen stream in the dark. In the long front room, a quiet settled that was not quite peace. Pete Maxwell, tired from a day of trade and talk, found himself host to an audience he had not asked for. Garrett wanted facts, the kind that close a circle and turn speculation into a road you can ride. Where is he sleeping? Who looked for him at supper time? Which doorway does he favor when he cuts through the yard? There is a hard edge to necessity when it borrows a chair in your house. Maxwell answered, then fell silent, as if one word too many might call a ghost through the door. What happened next has been told and retold until even its silence has a shape. Garrett stepped into Maxwell's bedroom to wait, the air heavy with the faint, sour sweetness of a hot room. Poe and McKinney took their posts in the yard, adjusting their eyes to that peculiar frontier darkness where nothing is truly black and nothing is entirely seen. Sometime after midnight, when the guitar had gone quiet and the wind had lost its last patience, a barefoot figure crossed the hard-packed ground toward the house. He moved with the ease of a man who knows the climb of every step and the tilt of every plank. In his hand, or tucked at his waistband, depending on the witness, lay the comfort of a pistol. He had come, it seems, for meat, a slice of beef from the kitchen, a late bite for a young man who kept irregular hours and an appetite like a spark. Inside the threshold, he paused, a shape in the bedroom, a breath that was not Maxwell's. He cocked his head, peering into layered darkness, and spoke the words that would never stop echoing. "Quién es?" The reply, if reply it was, came in the language Garrett knew best, the dry thunder of a pistol fired at arm's length. The shot went first to the chest, men said, and then the second followed so quickly, some swore it was the same breath meeting itself coming back. The barefoot man pitched forward, a flash of steel in his hand, then folded into the earth the way a shadow collapses when the lantern is snuffed. All at once the house became a hive. Startled shouts, feet on floorboards, Poe and McKinney pushing in, Maxwell wide-eyed and back against the wall, as if history had just entered his room without knocking. There is a kind of silence that belongs only to rooms where a man has just died. The kid's body lay at an angle that made no sense for a living thing, a hand still near the gun he carried like an extra rib. His eyes were open to nothing. Garrett stood with his pistol lowered, his breath working like a bellows coming down from heat. In some tellings he spoke a prayer. In others he simply exhaled the months of pursuit that had stuck in his lungs like sand. Poe, who will later write with the calm of a man stacking facts into a tidy fence, looked from the body to the sheriff and then to the door, as if to confirm that all the avenues a young outlaw might choose had finally ended in this square of floor. The house filled with people before the air could change temperature. A woman pressed her hands to her mouth. A vaquero made the sign of the cross, then made it again, as if once could not possibly be enough. Someone fetched a lamp. Someone else turned the chimney to throw more light. Faces leaned in to find a friend or a stranger in the sudden stillness. Identification in such moments is both absurd and necessary. A scar just above the hip, a chipped tooth, the unmistakable line of a jaw too pretty for the work it had done. Yes, they said, one after another, as if signing a ledger the night had opened. Yes, that's him. And yet, even as a scent collected like dew, argument began. Was it fair to fire in the dark? Did the outlaw speak first? Was he armed, truly armed, or only reaching for meat with a knife he carried from habit to plate? The frontier tolerates contradiction. It often prefers it. Garrett had taken the shot that ended a chapter the courts had failed to end. That for some was justice wearing its proper face at last. For others, what mattered was the manner of it. A bedroom, a question in Spanish floating in a small hot space, the reply steel cold and absolute. Legends do not begin in daylight. They start at the point where testimony breaks, and men must choose which story they can live with. The body was carried into another room and laid out there, a sheet pulled to the collarbone. Men filed past with hats in their hands. Women stood a little apart, whispering to each other, not unkindly. It is one of the Old West's odd mercies that even the notorious are given the respect due a human ending. Someone set a candle near his head, and someone else, faced with the practical math of death, asked for a coffin. Night leaked toward dawn. Outside, the first birds started their thin, insistent songs, indifferent to wars, pursuits, and verdicts. Garrett, McKinney, and Poe stood together apart from the murmuring. The sheriff's face looked older by a few years than it had at sundown. Victory in the Old West seldom brings relief. It brings weight. He knew that when he stepped out of that room and turned his back to the house, the telling would begin without him. He had chosen a dark room over a bright gallows and taken the shot a courthouse could not. He did not know, no one does in the moment, how long a man can live inside such a choice. For now he had to reckon with the practicalities. The coroner, the paperwork, the telegram that would race ahead of sunrise to towns where editors kept sentences like revolvers in their desks, ready for use. At the cemetery the next day, they put the kid into the ground not far from Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Boder, comrades who had gone before him under the same hard sky. Dirt fell with a sound that always startles, no matter how many times a man has heard it. A simple marker did the work that marble would later try to perfect. Graves on the prairie have a habit of rearranging themselves. Floods come, boards rot, stones sink or get stolen for some homestead's doorstep. But for a time, days, months, the spot was exact, and men who had known him could find it without directions. People stepped lighter near such places, as if the ground might remember the footsteps that crossed it last. By afternoon, the versions proliferated like desert hares. One witness swore the room had been lit enough to count buttons. Another said it was black as a cellar. A third claimed he heard the outlaw say, "Hello," not "Quién es." And a fourth insisted there had been only one shot and the rest was embellishment. You could choose your music if you wanted, a ballad about justice served, or a lament for a boy who never had a chance to be anything but quick. Garrett's own account would come soon enough, written with Ash Upson's pen and a lawman's need to put the story in a frame that wouldn't warp over time. But even a book can only slow a legend, not halt it. The tale had already run ahead, hooves throwing dust, a young man too fast for the world and a sheriff whose patience outlasted him, until patience became a pistol in a darkened room. When the heat finally bled from the walls that evening, and the insects took up their high, unending choir, Fort Sumner looked almost as it had the day before, a town of kitchens and corrals, of quiet romances and louder debts. But if you listened closely, you could hear the change. What had been a circle of rumor around the kid had become a ring of fact, stubborn, troubling, definitive in the way death is always definitive. Men who had admired him did not stop admiring. Men who had feared him did not stop fearing the kind of man who could make the world bend around his will. And the sheriff, having finished one kind of work, found himself at the beginning of another, defending the decision he had made to those who would never set foot in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, yet meant to judge it all the same. The prairie would keep its counsel. The Pecos would continue indifferent and brown-green, past the cottonwoods that had watched so much human certainty come to such abrupt endings. Summer would lean toward dust and then to fall. Stories would multiply. But in the Maxwell house, in that small room where the air had trapped the powder's bite, the shape of the thing would remain stubborn. A question in Spanish, a lawman's breath held, and the deadly answer that finished the conversation. The county had asked for an ending. It had one now. Whether they liked its color was a different matter. When the dust at Fort Sumner settled and the mourners drifted off, Pat Garrett discovered that endings on the frontier rarely end. The first thing a man does after a shot like that is breathe. The second is speak. The third, if he hopes to outpace the rumor he has just birthed, is write. In 1882, his name appeared on the cover of a hurried, defensive, and strangely enduring volume, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. It bore the cadence of a lawman setting the record down before it slipped the leash, yet the sentences carried another hand's flourish. Ash Upson, newspaperman and friend, ghosted the prose and salted it with a journalist's appetite for scene. The book is not scripture, no book of that summer could be, but it fixed the bones of the tale that future generations would flesh with ballad and film. Whatever Garrett hoped for, a shield perhaps against the charge of murder in a dark room, he also minted the legend he had tried to lay in the ground. The country he served was changing beneath his boots. Steel rails drove west like stubborn ideas. Court calendars began to tame what bullets had once decided. Cattle kings learned the grammar of contracts. Merchants kept ledgers that did not need a six-gun to balance. A man like Garrett, built for the long ride, the long wait, the careful shot, found himself in an America that increasingly valued doorways and desks. He tried ranching near Roswell and in the dry folds of the San Andres country, where the wind talks all day and the stars speak all night. But the work that had made his name had also taught his enemies his face. And a legend, even the lawman's kind, is not always currency you can spend at the bank. Then a telegram from the East put him back in a kind of saddle. President Theodore Roosevelt, charmed by the frontier's few remaining titans, summoned Garrett to a different kind of duty, collector of customs at El Paso. The appointment carried the smell of cigars and the stiffness of good suits. January of 1902 saw him confirmed. By 1906 he was out, the politics of a border city proving rougher than some gunfights and far less honorable. El Paso had no tolerance for the old romance. It judged competence by receipts and schedules, and Garrett's mixture of blunt talk and proud bearing drew as much resentment as respect. When the term ran out, Washington did not renew it. The lawman went home to the wind again, a little older, a little more alone. There is a patience to the desert that either teaches a man humility or tempts him into stubbornness. Garrett, who had outwaited winter in mesquite and greasewood, returned to land that demanded the same endurance and offered the same parched rewards. A little grass, if the rains came. A little water if the spring held. A little money if creditors would bide their time. He was not ruined. Ruin is theatrical, and his end was something quieter. But he carried debts like extra weight on a horse. He quarreled with neighbors. He tried a few deals that did not change their shape when you looked at them in cooler light. Men who had once tipped their hats with admiration now did so with a careful neutrality. He had discovered the hard fact of fame. It solves nothing in a dry year. On February 29, 1908, a day that only exists every fourth year, as if it were born with its own superstition, Garrett rode a dirt road northeast of Las Cruces in a light wagon. The sun lay over the desert like a sheet of tin. With him rode Carl Adamson, a man tied to a grazing lease that had angered a young cowboy named Wayne Brazel, whose goats had wandered where others wanted grass to grow. The quarrel, which kind of stock, whose ground, what promise had been made, was a frontier quarrel as old as water and older than fences. It reached its brief and terrible conclusion somewhere among mesquite and open sky. 2 shots, 1 head wound, 1 through the body. Pat Garrett fell out of his life and into the hands of a coroner's jury that wrote, in crabbed letters, what the county would accept as formal truth. Gunshot wounds inflicted by one Wayne Brazel. The trial that followed lasted a day. Self-defense, said the attorney. A sudden fear, a gun pointed his way. The jury agreed. The lawman who had made the territory's most famous arrest and its most disputed kill exited history in a paragraph shorter than some barroom toasts. The simplicity of that verdict has never satisfied everyone. Out here, facts are like fence posts, useful, upright, and never numerous enough to forbid speculation from wandering where it pleases. Some whispered that other men stood in the brush that day, hands not as clean as the record requires. Others argued that whatever conspiracy existed was the oldest of all. Pride and money, the 2 stockmen a few dollars and a few tempers apart. What the paper says is what the county keeps. What men think is what the desert endures. There is a kind of arithmetic to reputations that nobody writes down. Garrett, who had killed the kid and then tried to live like a ranchman among other ranchmen, discovered that the past hangs on a man with a weight he cannot always measure. Friends remembered him as upright, if sharp around the edges. Enemies called him arrogant and unlucky, the sort to make trouble in a room already full of it. Both portraits can be painted from the same face. In the last years, you could see the fight leave him by inches, the way a proud horse learns to take a shorter pull at the bit, not because he feared conflict, but because the conflict he faced had turned into contracts and accusations and balances due. Those are harder to face with a 6-gun. His book, meanwhile, refused to die. University presses reissued it. Library shelves leaned on it. Storytellers plundered it for bright, hard details and then hammered those into new shapes. Dime novels first, celluloid later. In this way, Garrett kept doing the strangest thing. He kept giving the kid a life after death. Every time a reader turned those pages, the outlaw stood up again in that darkened room at Fort Sumner and asked a question that every American carries somewhere. Who is it? Who am I if I choose law? Who am I if I choose nerve? Garrett had not meant to feed the myth, but he had. and with each reprint the country signed again the bargain it loves. Romance with consequences enough to feel real, and mercy enough to be forgiven when the credits roll. You can still walk where these men walked. The Lincoln Courthouse is quiet most days, the stairwell keeps its creak. Stinking Springs is a ruin now, the stone mostly gone, the wind still correct in its opinions. At Fort Sumner, markers cluster like a short conversation among old friends. O'Folliard, Beaudry, the boy they followed. In Las Cruces, records sit in drawers under careful lights. The coroner's words, the clipped report that passes for a full reckoning of a hard afternoon. These places do not settle arguments. They hold them. They make a man slow down and count his own certainties, as if tallying cattle by lamplight and discovering the numbers don't come out the same twice in a row. If there is mercy for Garrett, it is this. The country he gambled on, order in a lawless tract, a rope instead of another gun, did, in the longer count, arrive. Not by virtue of a single bullet nor a single badge, but by the dull, inexorable pressure of courts, rails, and towns that learned to prefer the boredom of peace to the bright excitement of blood. Was he fairly repaid? No land ledger answers that. He left behind a widow and children, friends who came when called and some who did not, a grave first at the Oddfellows plot and then elsewhere as the city changed its mind about where to keep its history. He also left, unintentionally, a mirror. Look at Garrett and men will see duty or pride. Look at the kid and they will see mischief or tragedy. Look at both and you will see the American West studying itself, wondering which story it wishes to believe on any given day. The gamble, then, was not simply the nerve to wait in a bedroom with a pistol and a plan. It was the belief that a county could be forced to turn a corner, that killing a legend would become the foundation of a quieter future. He won the gunfight. The rest of the wager remained unsettled, paid out in fragments, appointments that soured, friendships that thinned, a last road under a high sun, a coroner's cramped script, and a jury that preferred a tidy ending to a long quarrel. Across the years, you can still hear him breathing in that Fort Sumner room, counting the months he had chased a boy who moved like quicksilver, and understand why, when the shadow entered and asked its question, he answered not with a name, but with the only language the time still honored. The cost of that fluency arrived later, on a road where there were no witnesses worth believing, only men and their reasons, and the dust that took them both. Stand a while on the empty road outside Las Cruces, where the mesquite still scrawls its dark handwriting across the sand, or pause on the courthouse stairs in Lincoln and listen for the stairs' tired creak, or lean a palm against the sun-warmed adobe at Fort Sumner and imagine powder smoke held in plaster. The places remain. The question does too. What did Pat Garrett's gamble buy, really? Not just in coins and appointments, but in the heavier currency of memory, order, and myth. On paper, the ledger looks simple enough. A county racked by feud hires a new sheriff. The sheriff rides, captures, loses, and finally kills the most notorious outlaw in New Mexico territory. The reward is paid. The headlines quiet. The courts resume their patient arithmetic. But the West never stays on paper. It bleeds through. Garrett's gamble staked more than his life in a dark room. It staked his name against the country's appetite for stories where law and legend arm wrestle until the table breaks. He won the shot. The legend won the century. The case for Garrett is as clean as a tin star polished on a vest. He was a peace officer, sworn to haul a killer to a gallows the courts themselves had ordered. When the courts failed to hold him, Garrett finished what the summons and sentence had begun. He spared Lincoln another siege, spared Mesilla another trial turned carnival, spared ranch hands and shopkeepers the nervous tick of looking over their shoulders in daylight. He did the job. Old-timers who walked the plaza in those years said the nights got quieter, the telegraph sent more freight and fewer alarms, the trains ran with fewer men climbing aboard with bad ideas and a Winchester. Order is not romance, but it is a relief, a kind of civic breath that towns only notice when they've forgotten how to draw it. And yet turn the badge and look at its reverse. Men muttered that Garrett took the easy way, ambush in a bedroom, the outlaw half surprised and speaking Spanish into darkness, that he had spent months promising a rope and then delivered a pistol's answer, that a lawman should shine daylight on a killing, even if it kills him to do it. Some say the room was too dark for certainty, others that it was just light enough to see what you wanted to see. If the West is a school, its hardest lesson might be this: legality and legitimacy are not twins. They're cousins who fight at picnics. The law was on Garrett's side. A certain idea of fairness wandered off toward the cottonwoods and didn't come back. What then do we make of the kid, the boyish tin type that refuses to grow old? For one audience, he is pure mischief, quick-draw charm, a crooked grin, the outlaw as folk saint in a hat a size too large. For another, he is the residue of a county's worst fever, a killer with a laugh, more accident than principle, proof that charisma can walk men into graves. Both readings live under the same sky. The miracle of the West, if miracle is the word, is that it keeps both truths in the same room without breaking the furniture. The kid loved the theater of danger. He learned to play it like a fiddle. But he also moved through homes where saints' candles burned in kitchen alcoves, where Spanish and English braided like a rope, where a borrowed guitar and a hand on a girl's waist could feel like amnesty while it lasted. Communities are complicated shelters. They made space for him until they couldn't. Garrett's gamble was, in part, a wager that affection would not outrun fear forever. Step back from the men and watch the century tilt. The Old West, as Garrett knew it, was already being replaced by the quieter tyranny of schedules. Railroads, court calendars, customs offices with ledgers squared to the penny. A six-gun could not argue with a timetable. A sheriff's nerve could not keep cattle watered in a drought or coax a loan from a bank gone cautious. Garrett was built for a particular kind of frontier problem, a breathing myth that needed to be caught, a roaming wound that needed to be closed. When the problems turned into ink and interest, he found himself speaking the wrong language to a new world. The badge had purchased its order. The order no longer needed the man. Dime novels, then newsprint. Then film did what the desert wind could not. They put life back into bones. Every retelling took its tithe. Some polished the outlaw until he gleamed. Others sanded him down to a cautionary tale. Garrett became a figure to argue with rather than a wound to bind. The iron-spined lawman for those who want a fence line in their minds. The cold mechanic for those who believe the hero should risk the sunshine. His own book, meant as a brace against slander and forgetting, turned into a quarry. Storytellers chipped its stone and built new houses, then invited the country in to sit by a fire that pretended not to have been stolen from his yard. That is the paradox of the sheriff's legacy. He ended a life and extended a legend, both with the same squeeze of a trigger. You can trace the ripple if you stand still long enough. The OK Corral's smoke will drift across the Lincoln Courthouse if you're patient with the wind. The Johnson County War in Wyoming will send a telegram back to Mesilla if you listen to how men talk when power's at stake, and law is a tool sharp in some hands and dull in others. Garrett's gamble foreshadowed those later reckonings, moments when a country tried to decide if it preferred the crisp sentence of a judge or the quick certainty of a gun, the public square, or the private room. We mostly chose the square. We have never entirely given up the room. But the truest measure of the wager may be neither the trial he secured nor the shot he fired. It may be the habit he taught the country, to love its peace but keep its taste for danger, to praise the law while buying tickets for the outlaw's matinee. That is an American compromise if there ever was one. We want the track laid straight and the paymaster honest, and we want, tucked in our pocket like a talisman, the story of a youth who ran so hard the world had to set its watch by him. Garrett collected the fare for that ride and then, in the ledger's cruelest symmetry, paid it himself on a lonely road. 2 bullets and a verdict too tidy to be believed, too official to be dismissed. Walk the graveyards if you doubt the balance sheet. At Old Fort Sumner, the markers lean like men in conversation. Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Boder, Billy the Kid. At Las Cruces, the coroner's ink still makes its spare declarations under museum glass. In Lincoln, the stairs still own their old creak. None of these places end the argument. They make it honest. They insist that history's drama is staged on floors that splinter and yards that flood. Not in the smooth rooms where we tell ourselves we would have chosen better had we been there. Perhaps we would have. Perhaps we would have done worse. What remains is the question that began in a dark bedroom. Who is it? It is the outlaw, yes, hunting meat and luck. It is the sheriff, yes, holding his breath until a whole county exhales. But it is also us, choosing, with each retelling, which virtues to polish and which sins to forgive. Some nights the answer is courage. Some nights it is calculation. Most nights it is both, braided like rawhide, pulling in opposite directions and somehow making a single rope. So, was Pat Garrett a courageous instrument of frontier law, or a man who crossed a line and spent the rest of his days proving he hadn't? The frontier gives us no unanimous jury. It offers sky and wind and a few hard facts, then invites us to lay our own judgment on the table like a deck of cards and see what hand we've actually been holding. Maybe that is the real legacy of the gamble, that a young outlaw and an older lawman still make us decide what kind of peace we want and what kind of price we're willing to pay for it. You have heard the shots in the stairwell and the hush in the bedroom, felt the chill at Stinking Springs and the heat in Mesilla, watched a sheriff's star cast a small circle of light against a very large night. The rest is yours now. What do you think? Was the gamble worth the cost? Ride down to the comments and lay your verdict next to the others. And if the trail still calls, there are more crossroads ahead, more wagers placed on dusty tables, more reckonings under a high western sun.